Chers auditeurs,
Dear listeners,
bonjour.
welcome in Comme d'Archi Podcast Season 3
Saison 3, dans le monde fascinant des architectes.
and in the architectural projects.
Je suis Anne-Charlotte Depondt, passionnée d'architecture et docteur des universités en histoire de l'archi.
I am one of the spokespersons of Anne-Charlotte, who is a PhD in architecture history.
Merci
Thank you
d'être avec moi aujourd'hui.
to be with us today.
Et
And
maintenant,
now,
lundi en français, place au talent.
and Wednesday, let's talk projects. In English, of course.
Bienvenue dans Comme d'Archi.
Dear listeners, welcome to the last episode of our Comme d'Archi summer series on the theme Short Chronicles and Beautiful Castles. This is Esther on behalf of Anne-Charlotte. Today, let's talk about a castle resurrected for a moment. For it no longer exists today, dismantled during the French Revolution and finally disappearing in 1816. Nothing remains of the castle built by Jules Hardouin Mansart except, at the top of the slope of the park, the representation on the ground of the walls of the royal pavilion. It was the last castle desired by Louis XIV. Have you guessed? It is, of course, the castle of Marly-le-Roi. In the end, the king, tired of beauty and crowds, persuaded himself that he sometimes wanted something small and solitary, as we read in the memoirs of the Duc de Saint-Simon. I made Versailles for my court, Trianon for my family, Marly for my friends, said Louis XIV. Nearly 1,000 years before the birth of the man who gave his name and fame to the town of Marly-le-Roi, Louis XIV, the forest was the property of the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. A parchment dated 25 April of the year 697 attests to an exchange of land between the abbey and a member of the Merovingian aristocracy during the reign of Gilles de Bertrois. Mairie-Lacus is the first known mention of the name Marly. It was this hill, already inhabited but on the edge of the great hunting forest, that Louis XIV chose to have Jules Hardouin Mansart build him a more intimate residence than Versailles. What the king sought and found at Marly was, perhaps, in the final analysis, what was missing at Versailles. Finally, the need to constantly reconcile the old and the new was undoubtedly the most restrictive aspect of the Versailles works. In Marly, created from scratch, the king was finally able to give free rein to his desire to do something absolutely personal. Thus, the last creation of the reign can be considered the most perfect. Gérard Mabille writes in Vue des Jardins de Marly. Nevertheless, from the 1690s onwards, the invitations are marks of political and administrative promotion. In the last 2 decades of the reign, I quote, Marly tends to become another ordinary residence, a second Versailles, even an anti-Versailles, wrote Benjamin Ringot and Thierry Sarment. In the spring of 1679, the Sun King created an edifice in Marly that has been described as a masterpiece of 17th century French architecture and gardens. Situated in a deep valley, the royal residence is only visible once you cross the boundaries of the estate. It is hidden in the forest near the village of Marly. The work lasted more than 5 years. The first visit of Louis XIV took place in November 1683 and his first stay in 1686. We will stop at the creation of Jules Hardouin Mansart, which breaks with the tradition of the French chateau designed between courtyard and gardens. Here, the architect offers a fragmented plan where several pavilions are set up along 2 main axes of perspective. The reception of the king and his family is anchored in a large pavilion in a central position. In front, on either side of the water mirror, like planets around the sun, 12 small pavilions are intended for guests. 4 service pavilions flank the royal pavilion, the guards' pavilion, the chapel, and the offices. From 1688 onwards, one of the pavilions contained baths for the guests. In 1703, the last two pavilions, on either side of the central pool, were transformed to house the so-called coronary globes. The latter, now kept in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, were deposited in 1715, just before the king's death. Marly offers a synthesis of Andrea Palladio's Villa Rotonda in Vicenza, with a centered plan for the royal pavilion, and the French tradition of hunting lodges, such as Chambord. The layout of the pavilions refers to the ephemeral festive architecture. In The Creation of Marly, the roles of Charles Lebrun, Jules Hardouin Mansart, and Louis XIV in the design of the complex, Claudia Hartmann writes, "Two essential elements that marked the site with their genesis are the architectural project comprising 24 identical guest pavilions and a central main pavilion, as well as the set of frescoes on the facades, which determined the configuration of this architectural complex." End of quote. In 1674, some of the pavilions were set up in the heart of the gardens during the fireworks display on the Grand Canal in Versailles. The facades of the Marly pavilions are decorated with flamboyant polychrome decorations, consisting of trompe-l'œil painted in fresco on plaster, similar to festive or theatrical settings. Their design was given by the king's first painter, Charles Lebrun. On the blind wall that joins the two service pavilions, the king had a false colonnade painted that opened onto a garden. This colonnade was to inspire the one in the Grand Trianon. Claudia Hartmann explains, Jules Hardouin Mansart's role clearly appears to be that of an extremely inventive architect who gave the site its concrete architectural form. His project for a secularized charter house as a retreat for the monarch is no less fantastic. The design and realization of such a risky concept was only possible because his patron saw it as the ideal implementation of his personal wishes and aesthetic tastes in a place of relative privacy. The general information on the gardens of the castle states that, during the first years, the gardens were bare, consisting only of grass glacis and lines of yew trees, with a central pond and a few surrounding basins with reduced water play. But the Sun King subsequently applied himself to developing them continuously. They consist of parterres in the center and, on either side of a north-south axis, groves, one on the east and the other on the west. The guest pavilions are linked by cradles of trellises and bordered by alleys lined with yew trees and variously pruned trees. Fed by the nearby Seine, water tables and spouts abound in Marly, thanks to the famous and colossal machine placed on the river. This masterpiece of hydraulic engineering for its time was built in 1682. Its water supply was operational in 1685. The quantity of water allowed the king to produce waterfalls, which could not be done at Versailles. La Rivière, a gigantic waterfall with marble decorations located to the south of the royal pavilion, and La Cascade Champêtre, built in the Le Vent Grove, were created. To the north, a monumental watering hole was built as a symbolic gateway to the bottom of the gardens, where it still stands today. The best artists participated in the enchantment of these places. Their works can be seen today in the Marly courtyard of the Louvre, a sort of recycling. Remember the famous horses of the Cousteau brothers at the Abreuvoir, which replaced in the 18th century the Renommée and Mercure of their uncle Coissevox, transferred to the entrance of the Tuileries. Marly is also home to the battle scenes by Van der Meulen in the King's Pavilion and the first French-style fireplaces, surmounted by an overmantel of mirrors by Pierre Lepôtre, the first signs of 18th century French drawing-room decor. The richness of the water, together with the buildings and gardens, made the place, according to contemporaries, the most beautiful place in the world. The revolution began the work of destruction with gusto, and it was completed in the next 3 decades or so with neglect, crass behavior, and other cultural lowlights. Since then, and recently, other palaces with sublime architecture and uses more in keeping with our times have been destroyed. I won't list them. All this to make way, for the most part, for kilometers of concrete lined up without genius, planted with 3 leagues and just adorned with great speeches. With our thanks to the website of the Château de Versailles for all the resources on the Château de Marly-le-Roi. So, let's tackle season 4 next week, full of energy, with humanity and without demagogy, nor vindictive and arbitrary destruction, in defense not only of architectural quality, the profession, culture, and the arts, but also in defense of our planet. No labels. And it doesn't matter whether global warming is caused by humans or by interplanetary alchemy. It is here and we must act. Dear listeners, thank you for tuning in. Let's meet again next week for the launch of Season 4 on in-depth subjects in the company of the Leclerc Associé Agency, with whom we are continuing the debate. And until then, take care of yourselves. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening. Thanks to Julien Rebourg, sound engineer, who is collaborating with us today. Don't forget to tune in to our previews on Instagram at Comme d'Archi Podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, don't hesitate to promote it by giving it 5 stars and a little comment on Apple Podcast or on your favorite podcast platform. And above all, subscribe to listen to all of our episodes for free. See you soon, and until then, take care of yourself.